Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Survivors.org podcast. I'm your host, Angela Rose. I'm the founder and the executive director of PAVE, Promoting Awareness, Victim Empowerment. And Survivors.org is a resource that was created by PAVE to help survivors thrive after trauma. I am so excited. We have two incredible guests. We're going to be talking about the way that trauma impacts not only our emotions, but the impact that it has on our physical body, and some tips for you all to understand our trauma better and ways that we can heal ourselves. So I would like to first introduce Beth O'Hara.
It's so good to be here. And this is a critical topic, both for people who are dealing with trauma, to think about the physiological impacts of trauma and the immune dysregulation that often occurs. And then also I'm hoping that people who stumble across this, who have mast cell activation and they're wanting to learn more, that they're going to think about the trauma and the stress element. But here's why I really want people to listen is before the pandemic, the population studies showed us that 9 to 17% of the general population had mast cell activation syndrome. It's much higher now. We don't have repeated studies yet, but we know it's higher. That pandemic's been traumatic for people. And in the trauma population, the incidence of mast cell activation syndrome is astronomical. It's very, very common. So I think this will put some pieces together and maybe some things that really help people turn the corner in knowing about why they're having the different kinds of physiological symptoms that they're having.
Thank you for that. Before we bring it over to Dr. Kukla, I'd love for you to just dig a little bit deeper for folks that have no idea what mast cell activation means. Can you give us just kind of like a high level layman's description of what that is?
Yes. So mast cells, first of all, are immune cells. They're sensing and defending cells of the immune system. They have other roles too, but that's what I'm going to focus on. They're looking for three major categories of things. Pathogens, could be tick-borne pathogens like Lyme bacteria, Babesia, Bartonella, can be mold spores. There could be viruses. They're looking for toxins, chemical toxins, mold toxins, heavy metals, and the third category, stress and trauma. That's their primary role. They reside in every tissue in our body except the retina, which is why we can get a huge variety of symptoms. And very important for our conversation is to know that they are also line every nerve sheath, every nerve ending, and there's constant crosstalk between the mast cells and the nervous system. So the nervous system is literally communicating to the mast cells every thought, every feeling, and the mast cells are responding and then communicating back. And what are they communicating? Am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? So when we're not safe, either from pathogens, toxins, can also be, we're going to put in this trauma piece, physiological things as well, can be things like EMFs or surgeries, those kinds of things. But when we're not safe for any reason, their job is to create inflammation. And if it's something like you get an injury, you get some inflammation as part of that natural healing response. So you get a cold, you get lots of inflammation in your sinuses and your throat to help surround those pathogens and get them out. And then you recover and you forget about it. Mast cell activation syndrome happens when the onslaught of any combo of those pathogens, toxins, chronic stressors becomes beyond the threshold of what we have the resiliency for. And now we're in a dysregulated state. So they're inappropriately creating inflammation because they've lost their fine tuning. So that can show up in skin symptoms like rashes, hives. Flushing can show up in GI symptoms like diarrhea, constipation, heartburn, just GI pain. Reactions to foods or supplements or medications can show up in brain fog, insomnia, if it's affecting the brain, neurological pain, if it's affecting the nerves, crawling sensations, all kinds of things like that, bladder pain, bladder burning in the lungs, trouble breathing, heart palpitation. So you think of a system in the body, think of an inflammatory symptom, the mast cells have a role in it. So mast cell activation syndrome is defined as a multi-systemic, meaning it has to be in 2 or more systems. So if you just have seasonal allergies, that's all you have. That's not mast cell activation syndrome. 2 or more systems of the body, like gut and skin or brain and bladder, with or without allergy symptoms, with or without anaphylaxis, and with or without hypersensitivities. So those are the people, if they have hypersensitivities or holding their breath, trying to go down the laundry detergent aisle, can't get into an Uber because they've got little Christmas tree fragrance things and reacting. But not everybody has that either. It can show up all kinds of ways. So people can do a symptom survey I can tell them about, but that's the nutshell.
I would imagine it's very underdiagnosed. I would imagine that there's a lot of folks that have maybe gone to their primary care physician or other specialists that might not understand what this is. Would you?
That's absolutely right. This is one of the most underrecognized conditions affecting people today. And like I said in the beginning, the statistics, we were looking at up to 17% of the general population. People with any kind of chronic illness, our best estimates are well over 75% of people with chronic illness dealing with mast cell activation. So if there's inflammation, there's mast cell involvement. It's not taught in medical schools yet. It just got a diagnostic code in 2016. So if you think about how long other conditions like Alzheimer's or type 2 diabetes have been recognized, and that diagnostic criteria is still in evolution, this is quite new, and most people are learning about it on their own and then bringing it to their practitioners. And practitioners, many of them are trying to get up to speed, but there's still no training program. So there's a lot of resources out there, but people have to, as practitioners, go dig them up themselves and want to do the deep dives into it. It's not formalized yet, but we're getting there. We've come a long way since I first had mast cell symptoms before anybody had any clue what this was.
So you've really been a pioneer in this for so many years. I would love to hear your backstory if you're willing to share just how you got into this. And I know, and I've read a little bit about your background, but if you could share with our viewers and our listeners, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Well, I'll share a little bit with it that if people have heard me tell my story before, I've not shared before. But it'll play in with what we're talking about here. So when I was a child, we moved to the country, moved into an old farmhouse, and it was like being in Laura Ingalls Wilder kind of. And but that old farmhouse was full of mold. We were bitten by ticks all the time. So at a young age, I had we didn't know for decades, but I had mold toxicity, Lyme, Bartonella, Babesia. When I was 9, I was kicked in the head by a horse, and I was unconscious for over half an hour. And I didn't know if I was going to live as a 9-year-old. So it was pretty serious. Probably wasn't life-threatening because it came back, but I could have gone into a coma easily. But as a child at 9, the first thought I had when I realized I was sitting on the ground, there was blood on my head, and then I brought my hand down, it's covered in blood. The first thought I had was, oh my God, I killed myself. And then this shame came over me, like how much I had messed up, like it was my fault, Well, a little bit it was. I was feeding crackers to a horse, and I wasn't supposed to be interacting with the horse. I was 9. But that stayed with me a long time. I've had to do a lot of work on that. Symptom-wise, what started showing up, things really unraveled at that point. So I had this head injury, and I had the emotional trauma of it and no way of addressing it. And we didn't have treatments for concussions, and really it was beyond of a concussion. It was a traumatic brain injury. But I started getting hives head to toe. I would be scratching my skin. I had a lot of skin symptoms. I had asthma, exercise-induced asthma, severe anxiety, GI issues. For me, it was really chronic diarrhea, IBS kind of symptoms. And as I got older, I just kept going traditional doctor. I was put on a lot of antihistamines. So that helped, and Singulair and these different things that helped the symptoms. But I got worse as I got older. Now I know what happened was we weren't dealing with the underlying root causes. So we weren't dealing with the Lyme and Bartonella babesia. We weren't dealing with the mold toxicity. So just dampening that mast cell response gave those pathogens and those toxins an easier foothold because they'd knocked out basically my security guards. And I didn't have any way of addressing that trauma. So my nervous system was really keyed up for years. And I had some abusive relationships. I had 2 stalkers, and I was not making good relationship choices. And there were some emotionally abusive relationships. So it was just this chronic, intense stress. And that part I've not shared before, but I want people to think about these things. And by the time I was 28, my symptoms had spiraled down to where I had severe bladder burning, interstitial cystitis. It was so painful. It was just like this electric zap that would happen in my bladder and my urethra. I had vulvodynia. I had horrific joint pain. So it was like walking on ground glass, and I could barely hobble. I had to use a cane. So I was 28. When I would go to a grocery store, I had to use the little electric carts just to be able, I was both the joint pain and the fatigue. I could barely stand up for that long. Then there was the shame in that because people would look at me like, what are you doing? Are you lazy? You don't look sick. And I barely drove myself to the grocery. I had such panic attacks. I would drive to the grocery sometimes, and if there was any traffic, I'd have a panic attack in the parking lot. It would take so much work just to get there. I'd have to turn around and go home without going in. I couldn't bring myself to go. So I've really come a long way. I mean, I had intractable insomnia. I was sleeping it was just drifting. So I was never getting into deep sleep, but it was drifting, maybe an hour or 2 a night. That went on for over 4 years. But there were so many things. And there was a period of time I wasn't sure if I was going to live, but what got me through was I knew in my bones there was some way out of this. I didn't know if I would find the answer or if I'd find who had the answer, but I knew it existed. I just somehow knew. And I kept hitting these dead ends. I'd seen over 75 practitioners, was not wealthy at all, but stopped counting it. I had spent over $350,000 over about 15 years because I just put every dime into it. I didn't buy clothes. I bought supplements when I could tolerate them. I got down to 10 foods though, and I couldn't tolerate even a sprinkle of any supplements. I was super, super sensitive. And the turning point came when I realized I was finally, when functional medicine came on the scene, tried everything. I exhausted everything. I exhausted homeopathy, holistic medicine, traditional medicine I had long exhausted, and everything made me worse. Well, I hadn't addressed my nervous system. And I remember working with the most experienced functional medicine doctor the day that he said to me, Beth, I don't know what else to do. We've tried everything I know for 3 years. Even a sprinkle of quercetin, which is like one of the famous mast cell supporting supplements, would make me more inflamed. A sprinkle of curcumin would make me inflamed. A sprinkle of GABA, which is supposed to be calming, would make me anxious. And we're talking like dusting, just like a little in water. So my nervous system was a total wreck. And the other thing was I was still exposed to mold. So we have this nerve in our nose called the olfactory nerve that goes straight into the limbic system. And the limbic system gets really dysregulated in trauma, and it goes into hyperdrive, and we can get excess synapses, then excess activity there in trauma. And so mine was just lit up constantly. And it didn't matter what I tried. I felt so unsafe in my body that everything was on red alert. We're not going to trust anything. We're not going to trust foods, not going to trust supplements. Fortunately, I didn't lose water, but I've worked with people who couldn't tolerate even reverse osmosis filtered water, because they're so keyed up and in that fight or flight. So this physician said, I don't know what else to do. And that was the hardest thing I'd heard. I'd heard people tell me it was crazy. It was all in my head. I was making it all up. I wanted to be sick. And I knew that wasn't true, but sometimes you start to think like, so I did 10 years of therapy, really helped my resilience, helped my mindset, did not change my symptoms at all. And then I learned how to do vagal work and limbic resetting. And I got out of that toxic mold situation. And that is where things started shifting. And the other piece was I realized I had been on track to go to medical school, and I had to turn the scholarships down because I got so sick. But I had this background. I had this pre-med background. So I was able to draw on it. And every second I could get my brain to function, I would read some study on histamine intolerance or mast cell activation. And then when I figured out the mold, I'd read on mold. I'd read on Lyme, and started putting the pieces together, and had a lot of false starts because we didn't have a clue what we were doing. We were just figuring it out. And then I would be in these little groups of women dealing with the same thing. Sometimes it was a couple men, but it's usually women, and see what they were trying and what worked. And I'd see if could I try it. And I just really slowly clawed my way out, and then eventually got back to graduate school and finished a whole different road. I was going to go into neurology. Instead, I got a master's in marriage and family therapy, and then the doctorate in naturopathy, because I had realized traditional medicine didn't have the answers. It's wonderful if your spleen explodes, or you cut your arm off. Well, traditional medicine is going to save your life, but it wasn't a model that was developed for these kind of chronic illnesses. And so I had to go a whole different road. But that's how I got here. And then, all kinds of people came that had things that I hadn't dealt with. So I had to really expand my knowledge, and still drinking from a fire hose to keep up with everything that's coming out today.
Well, thank you for all of your work, and thank you for sharing that experience with our viewers and our listeners. It's so important, and we're very, very, very grateful. I want to turn it over to Dr. Michelle Kukla, who has really been a part of PAVE's journey in our board for many years. But I would love for us to touch on something that Beth talked about, which is shame, because I can tell you that so many survivors that I have talked to over the past 2 decades share that notion of shame. And I think that impacts our mind, bodies, and souls more than we can even imagine. So Michelle, if you can give us some insight onto the issue of shame and how that might impact our, all parts of ourselves, and maybe a little intro on yourself as well. So thank you for being here.
Sure. Thank you. I'm so glad we're here, and we're here all together. And thank you so much, Beth, for sharing that story. I'm sure that's resonating in a lot of people on the journey that you've had, and that determination to keep going and moving forward. Because I work with so many survivors that feel like they've been medically gaslit, and it's just they want to collapse, and it's hard sometimes to keep that journey up. And so I applaud you on just that tenacity, and the ability to put all this together in a puzzle, and then your capacity to also just keep illuminating this pathway for others, and sharing about mast cell activation syndrome. And because it just got introduced to me about a year ago, and it's played such a big role in some of the individuals I'm working with that come to me with complex issues in multiple systems that they're having health concerns with. And so I'm just very grateful for the attention that you're bringing to this.
Thank you.
And just having this platform is just wonderful. So, but to your point, I know you mentioned the shame, and in the space that we work with too. Obviously, shame can be such a big component. And what we know from neuroscience is that when we look at physical pain and where it shows up in the brain, it's the same area with shame. There's no difference there. And so it's truly really is, physiological mechanism that people are experiencing when they have that shame, and that difficulty just to even look somebody in the eyes. The body just naturally just wants to kind of collapse and move into that fold, and in terms of polyvagal theory. I know you mentioned the vagus nerve and doing vagal toning and limbic therapy, which is just wonderful for people to be able to have a trauma history, to be able to explore those methods for healing. But yeah, there is that instinct for the dorsal part of the vagus nerve to get activated with the shame component and just really try and suck people down, and just the capacity to create just the subtlest of movement for individuals to move out of that and explore therapies that can really do what I call shame busting, and explore it in a very gentle and compassionate way, which I think is very important. Yes.
I would love to learn a little bit more about limbic therapy, something I've never heard of before. So can you share just a little bit about that, Dr. Michelle?
Sure. And Beth, you're happy to jump in too, because I know you know a lot about this as well. So yeah, there's a couple of different, therapies and stuff. EMDR oftentimes is considered limbic therapy. I also instruct people on bilateral stimulation. That's very, very helpful for the limbic system, settling it down and quieting it down. And for those that don't know what bilateral stimulation is, it just simply is movement. Like we'll do like the large butterfly, but just a tapping on the left, a tapping on the right, and just going back and forth in a very slow fashion. It's very, very calming and soothing to the limbic brain, really helps settle it down. So that's a favorite method that I like to use as well with the limbic therapy. Deep breathing, that adds obviously the vagus nerve as well, but I am a fan of the deep breathing too, in terms of taking breaths in through the nose and exhaling through the mouth. And there's a variety of different patterns that people can do the deep breathing. I think some people are becoming more familiar with box breathing or square breathing, where you take that breath in to a count of 4 typically, then you hold for a count of 4, exhale to a count of 4, and then there's a pause for 4. So each movement is a part of the square in that process. There's 5 and 5 breathing is another popular one. That's typically my favorite. That helps you get into resonance breathing, which also plays a huge role in settling down the limbic nerve, the limbic part of the brain. So those are some of my favorite ones and easier ones to explore in the capacity for the time that we have here today.
That's
I
extremely.
think of it as really bringing us, like, it's really about creating a sense of safety. And just like Michelle's saying, we've got to rewire this part of ourselves, because we've got these neuronal pathways that are in those loops. And even as you were talking, Michelle, my brain started going out, because so many people we work with have dysautonomia. So this can cause dizziness, can cause nausea, can cause heart palpitations, a huge number of symptoms. And it's all coming from this vagal nerve that leaves at the very top of the neck. So a lot of people I work with, they've had inflammation for so long, the connective tissue here starts to degrade, and then there's some collapsing down. As you're talking about shame, and I was watching your body language as you were mimicking, that shame response. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, when we do that, we're collapsing on those nerves, and then we're in this loop of it, right? And then we're reinforcing those neural networks. So it's about disrupting it, getting in that sense of safety. And I love those starting points, because a lot of times we need things that are really accessible. And this is part of our, in our method, our MC360 method, the first step is stabilization. We're going to stabilize the mast cells, but we're also going to stabilize the nervous system. And for some people who can't tolerate supplements or foods or medications that they need, that's the entry point. Because if you can get the nervous system to feel safe, then it can communicate to the mast cells that they're safe, and they can start to calm down just through that mechanism. And that can open the door for the next level of things to be able to tolerate supplements or foods or medications or things like that. Now, some people don't have any sensitivities, but that's a way to move. But everybody in our practice does nervous system stabilizing. And there are also some programs that are bigger programs that people can do 6-month, year-long programs. But sometimes people need a really gentle starting point, like Michelle's describing. The box breathing is so helpful. But it's about taking us from this place of this loop of I'm not safe, I'm not safe, I'm not safe, I'm not safe. I used to be so extremely fatigued, but I couldn't lie down and rest. And I felt like so I love to study marine biology. It's just like my fun thing on the side is to study sea animals. And so I felt like a shark. Most species of sharks cannot stop. They'll sink to the bottom. They have to, even when they sleep, they have to keep moving. And I felt like that. I had to keep moving. I had to keep moving. I had to keep moving. It wasn't safe to be still. And when I was still, I'd go into a panic. So one of the ways that I started disrupting it, I don't think I could have jumped into the limbic programs. I didn't know about them. So I started disrupting it through movement and movement meditations. And then there are also things like somatic focusing. That's just a movement to start to move the pattern of the emotion. It's so powerful and it's critical. And what I really want people to know as well is when we're dealing with chronic illness, or we're dealing with this kind of nervous system dysregulation, we have to simultaneously reboot the limbic system and the vagal nerve. And if we have mast cell activation and the mast cells all together, because they all three are governing hypervigilance. And if we just, what I've seen over and over, a lot of people come in, they're like, well, I'm already doing these breathing practices, so I'm good. Or I'm listening to this meditation on YouTube, so I'm good. I don't want to do any more. And I'm like, well, one, you're not stable yet. And two, if we just reboot the limbic, the vagal nerve and the mast cells are going to take over in their hypervigilance. If we just reboot the vagal nerve, the limbic is going to take over. If we just reboot the mast cells, the limbic and the vagal will take over. So we've got to bring them down in these complex cases. This may not be for everybody. In these complex cases we see, we've got to bring them all down. And if somebody's really doing a comprehensive nervous system program, but they don't feel like they're getting over the trauma piece, it might be helpful to look at the biochemistry side and to look at, well, what can we do with some neurotransmitter support? What we can do to calm these mast cells? Because if the mast cells are giving a danger signal, as soon as you get your vagal nerve, your limbic system to settle some, the mast cells are going to say, nope, still not safe. And they're going to communicate back to the nervous system. It's going to just override what you've done and go, oh, back into hypervigilant mode. We're not safe enough yet. And we've got to be out of the triggers. So the triggers of, if people are exposed to mold, I have not been able to get them to reboot their nervous system fully. And even these are people who, not always, but a lot of times have trouble taking a deep breath, feel more anxious taking a deep breath because you're inhaling more mold. So that can be a cute clue that there might be mold in the environment, or a chemical toxin or something like that. Sometimes people have sewer gas, or they have propane leaking from a propane stove or something like that. We've got to think about not being exposed to fragrances, to these other things if we're really sensitive. And people have to be safe emotionally. So if we're in an abusive relationship, I'm not going to get their nervous system and their mast cells calmed down, because why would you calm down? It's not safe. It's the same as there's a bear sleeping in the bedroom. So how are you going to be able to take a nap on the couch when the bear could come out anytime?
That's right. Absolutely. And I want to go back to something that you said. And I think for me personally, as a survivor working through my trauma, and I've been on a 5-year journey, I didn't realize until recently that overworking yourself is actually like a big sign of trauma. And so I never thought about that until very recently. And so I would love for either of you to speak to that, because I think a lot of entrepreneurs, we think about us as, the boss babes, or, obviously there's a lot of male survivors as well. So I think a lot of people that, we just keep going and keep working, and we think about it as a good thing. But of course, maybe at the root of that overworking is the root of it could be trauma. So I'd love to hear from either of you on that.
Michelle, you want to start?
Sure, I can take that one. Yes, oftentimes people use that as a coping skill. We have lots of different coping methods. Some might drink alcohol a little bit too much. Some might gamble. Some might use illicit drugs to just cope, to numb things. And then there's definitely the piece of working. And people often think that it's not such a big thing because I'm working, I'm being productive. But it is an area that we do need to look at. And also too, I have noticed as well is piece that Beth has been bringing out so clearly quite often here is the idea of the body saying, am I safe, am I not safe? The nervous system being able to do that, neuroception. I've heard studies say that then in terms of the nervous system, it's asking 4 times a second, am I safe, am I not safe, am I safe, am I not safe? So this is going on unconsciously, your body's doing this. And so for many times survivors, if you're going and you're active, you don't have to worry about being in a state of rest and having to deal with that vulnerability, because that's kind of naturally programmed in to some extent. Is if I'm at a state of rest, I'm trying to let the limbic system go to rest here a little bit. And then am I really truly safe? Because that bear could be out there at any given moment. So that's another way they channel the energy is through movement and mobilization that way, and just staying active. Because now I don't have to worry about that capacity of sitting and trying to rest the nervous system and knowing that I might be vulnerable. So
that's my next well, that's the thing I'm working on the most right now, because when I went from, so I've always been high achieving, and even and most of my clients were high achieving before they got sick. I was working 3 jobs as an undergrad. I was taking graduate level courses. I was teaching at a vocational school where I should have had a master's, and I didn't have a bachelor's yet. I was just always pushing and pushing. And I was doing independent study research with a PhD student, all this stuff. And I wasn't getting much sleep. And then of course I crashed. And then I couldn't do anything. And there was another layer of shame, was that I felt like I had nothing to contribute. And after I got married to my current husband, I've been married before, but after I got married to my current husband, 6 months later, I crashed even harder. I told him I had these health issues. He was on the road all the time, so he didn't really get it because he only saw me on weekends. And then 6 months into this new marriage, here I am in a severe health crisis. And I could not function. It was a good day if I could get the dishwasher unloaded. And that was it. That was all that got done. I didn't get it loaded. That was it. I couldn't cook dinner. I couldn't do the bills. I couldn't get my brain to function. And I felt like I had nothing to offer. I had nothing to offer the world. And if I had nothing to offer, then I wasn't worth anything. I had no value. And when I got my health back, I wasn't even fully back yet. It was just as I got functioning back, I headed right into graduate school. And it was like I had to run to make up for all this lost time. And I'm still unraveling that. And I like to share with people what I'm still unraveling, so they don't think like, oh, I'll never get there, because it's just this process that we keep peeling back, right? And I noticed that I have chronic pain still from these injuries. And then I had other car accidents that worsened it. My pain's so much worse when I overwork, and my nervous system's not as settled. But if I can shift my focus from I have to achieve to that's not my job. My job's not to get all of this stuff produced for people. My job is just to show up and be in service. And being in service is also about not just being in service to everybody else, because that's a value thing again, but that includes me too, and being in service to me. So a lot of this journey has been the very long journey from where I had no love for myself to I'm just as important as my clients. I'm just as important as the people who are in our community. And my whole life have put everybody else first. One more tidbit that's coming to my mind on the shame piece, and I don't know why I'm sharing this, but it might help somebody, is when I was in my late teens, early 20s, my shame was to the extent that when I was in public, I thought everyone was staring at me with hatred. I had no clue that they weren't thinking about me. And then when I realized that, it almost felt worse, like I didn't exist. And that was a big piece I had to work on, was all these people aren't even thinking about me, so they're not judging me. But it was a projection. It was how much I was judging myself. And probably I'm sharing that maybe to give people hope that, there's always more to go, but I really love myself today. I'm in my mid 40s. It's taken a lot of work and a lot of time, and I keep working on it every day. But I think part of healing from these chronic illnesses and the trauma is that loving ourselves enough to take care of ourselves.
I love that. Thank you for your vulnerability. I felt that and it resonated so deeply with me because especially the self-worth piece, because when I went to therapy years after, my trauma, I realized at the core of who I was that I didn't feel good enough. And that was such a profound realization because oftentimes when we're in it, we can't see it. And so, finding a great therapist, processing this. So what I would love to hear from both of you, and maybe we'll start with Dr. Kukla, is what advice do you have for survivors of trauma that maybe know that they need some help but haven't gotten there yet? And so any advice that you can have for survivors of trauma, maybe to give a little hope, maybe to give a little advice, anything you'd like to say to survivors out there that might be listening? We'll start with you, Dr. Michelle.
Oh, there's always hope. I always like the word hope in terms of using it as an acronym for hold on, pain ends. And I truly believe that, in practicing for over 20 years, I'll get people coming into the office for the first time ever, 20 years after a trauma, et cetera, and they're ready to sit down and to actually look at themselves and to be able to start to cultivate that skill, like Beth was saying, of self-love and compassion towards oneself and kindness, and to have somebody be able to share that experience with them. It's amazing. Wherever you're at in this journey, there's always going to be a porthole for you, whether it's, a podcast and sitting and listening to that if you're in that capacity at that point, in terms of being ready for it. The healing circles, in terms of PAVE, hosts the healing circles. Maybe that might be just a nice little way to just kind of introduce some of this healing modality. But there are plenty of providers and practitioners and wellness professionals that are continuing to stay dedicated to finding more and more strategies and avenues and techniques and methods that will fit for somebody, that they feel like they can continue to explore and be open to exploring it, and to get results from that.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. And before we bring it over to Beth, I just want to touch on something that Dr. Michelle talked about, the healing circle. So every month we meet the last Thursday of every month, and we always have a different theme. And so it's ironic the timing, but last night was all about thriving after triggers. And so it was so amazing to come together in community for everybody to share like what has helped us overcome triggers when we get into those moments. And so a lot of the breathing folks talked about, and so we're kind of creating a lot of these resources to share with our fellow survivor community. But I think it's so great when we come together to heal together, and there's just so much peace in that. So thank you for that, Michelle. And so Beth, what advice do you have for survivors?
Yeah, I have tried a lot of things. It was kind of this I feel like this is my role in life, is to try a lot of things and figure out what works and what doesn't work. And what works for me doesn't work for everybody, and that's okay. So one key is, I think the word Michelle used that I use for myself a lot is just the tenacity to keep trying things. And I have had 200% more failures than I've had successes, but I kept trying things. I had some therapists who were just wonderful, and I wouldn't be where I am in life without them. I've had some who were horrific. And so if the first one had been horrific and that was my only experience, I might have never gone back. But I kept trying. So I gave it another try. And I've had modalities that made me worse. And so I had to let them go. So I think that trust in ourselves and discernment and listening, for me, one of the most healing experiences has been time in nature. And because it reminds us who we really are. And there's a safe connection there. And my practice every day, I'm lucky now to get to live by a nature preserve, a woods, and it's in the backyard. It starts in the backyard. And so I go sit there at the edge of the woods. I'm very careful about ticks, but I sit there and I feed the birds every day. And I sit with the birds and the trees, and not just from an aesthetic place, but from a relationship and a deep connection. And it took me a long time to be able to foster that. and to open to that. But that's been just incredibly healing, because it reminds us, it mirrors for us something in us that we all have, is this capacity to heal and thrive. And if we think about how much nature has been through and how much, we've done to our planet, and is just really traumatic, and yet nature finds a way. It keeps finding a way to not just make it through or barely eke along. Nature will explode back to life, and there's so many gifts in there. So just finding a moment to connect, or to see, like, oh my gosh, look at the sunset, or the moon, or reminds us of our innocence and that purity. And the last piece that's at least been really instrumental for me, and I think is important for all of us with trauma, is boundaries. And when we've had our boundaries violated, it's hard to remember that we deserve them. And we forget, and then we get all mixed up, like, well, what is a healthy boundary? What's not a healthy boundary? So people either get way too loose, which was me, or way too rigid. And boundaries, though, what helped me reestablish boundaries was to realize boundaries are about keeping me and the other person safe. And the more boundaried I am, the more my clients feel safe, the more my friends feel safe, because my family, because they know what's okay, what's not okay, and they don't have to guess. And I know when somebody doesn't have boundaries, I feel really anxious, because I don't know, like, what's going to be okay, what's not going to be okay. But if somebody comes in with just solid, clear boundaries, I can let go and relax. And so that inspires me. When I see somebody else with really solid boundaries, inspires me to have really solid boundaries too. And I feel so much better. My nervous system can let go. My immune system improves. My mast cells calm down, because I'm emotionally safe, or physically safe if I'm setting a physical boundary.
That's beautiful. So we're almost out of time, but we'll start with you, Beth. How can people find you if you have any closing comments, but would love for you to share any social media or your website so people can learn more?
We have a website, Mast, MAST as in Tom, Cell, CELL 360.com. Tons of free resources for people. There's a symptom survey people can take if they're curious to see if this might be them. We have some courses. We have a nervous system reboot course. We have a mold course. We have a mast cell supplements course. And we have a Facebook community that's really warm, lovely community, very inviting. We have free Facebook Lives most Mondays. And we'd love for people to just come join us and check it out. And lots of resources there for people.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. You're such a pioneer. We're so grateful for your time. Dr. Michelle Kukla, where can folks find you?
They can go ahead and just Google my name, Dr. Michelle Kukla, and it'll usually pull up my website there. And there's also a link on my website personal to a group private practice that I also have called a Healthy Living Counseling Center. So that's another place. And as well, there is a big section too for free resources and a list of a lot of the free meditation activities that many other professionals are putting on. Healing circles, etc. So there's a lot of avenues too for people that really need to be cautious regarding their funding situation, and a lot of available resources there on that tab.
Beautiful. Well, I just want to thank both of you so much for your time and for the bright, beautiful light that you shine on all of us today and what you do for the world. Thank you so much. And for anyone listening, you can get free resources as well at survivors.org. You can learn more about PAVE at shatteringthesilence.org. And until next time, please take care of yourself, love yourself, take care of each other, and together, let's change the world. Thank you all so much. Have a beautiful rest of your day. See you next time.